All right, welcome everybody to another masterclass here at A Mind for All Seasons. This week we're talking about Parkinson's disease. And to set the stage, I invite you to go back in your minds to October of 1974, when the greatest sports event of the 20th century occurred. It was known as the Rumble in the Jungle. You may recall, whether you were alive then or not, that it involved Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. Now, Muhammad Ali had won Olympic gold in 1960, and he had 56 wins by the end of his boxing career, 37 of those by knockouts. He had only 5 losses to very notable opponents. The Rumble in the Jungle, though, was the biggest sporting event in the 20th century by a lot. It was not only incredibly hyped, but it's estimated to have had 1 billion viewers. There were 60,000 attendees who went and saw it live in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. You may recall that Muhammad Ali had retired, or had better said, been forced into retirement because he didn't want to go to the Vietnam War. He claimed religious reasons for that. And so he was stripped of his heavyweight championship titles, and he hadn't been able to box for 3.5 years. He was able to come out of that retirement and go over to DRC and spend a few months adapting to the climate. And when the Rumble in the Jungle occurred, everybody was watching. His opponent, George Foreman, was 25 years old, and he was totally undefeated. He had been knocking out everybody right and left. He was a powerhouse of a guy. Muhammad Ali had a very different kind of a way of approaching a fight. He was known for his fast footwork and his incredible technique. And Ali went into it a 4-1 underdog, but he ended up winning in the 8th round by a knockout. He developed a strategy known as rope-a-dope, which involved leaning against the ropes, protecting himself, while George Foreman just rained down punch after punch on Muhammad Ali. In the process, though, Foreman got tired out, and any time Ali got a chance, he'd send a punishing punch Foreman's way, often hitting him in the face. So by the time they were in the 5th, 6th, 7th rounds, George Foreman's face was pretty swollen, and he was beginning to get truly exhausted. By the 8th round, Ali was able to make his move, and he gave him a devastating punch to the face that sent George Foreman to the mat. Ali was able to do what a lot of people thought he was not able to do. Well, as successful as Muhammad Ali was as a boxer, there was one thing that he couldn't knock out, and it ended up knocking him out. It was called Parkinson's disease. He died in 2016 at the age of 74 from Parkinson's disease, something that he was first diagnosed with in 1984 when he was 42 years of age. But his doctors and researchers, looking back, recognized that there were symptoms showing up even before he was formally diagnosed. And that's typical of a lot of people. Now, if you or someone that you love is facing Parkinson's disease, or if you're serving people in a long-term care community living with Parkinson's disease, I think it's really important to take a look at what we know about Parkinson's and what can make a difference. Let's first talk about some preliminaries here. Let's understand different stages of Parkinson's disease. And I would say that, as with any neurodegenerative condition, the earlier we can identify a problem and intervene to do something about it, the better. Ultimately, the best way to treat Parkinson's is to never get it in the first place. And there are a lot of things that we can do from a prevention standpoint. But if someone has Parkinson's disease, they tend to progress through these stages. Stage 1 involves mild symptoms. They don't necessarily interfere with the person's life, and the symptoms are things that are harder to quantify. More on that to come. Stage 2 often involves tremors that are increasingly noticeable, and rigidity becomes more pronounced. Both sides of the body are affected, so people often have walking problems or problems with their posture. By stage 3, kind of the mid-stage of Parkinson's disease, movements are slowed a lot more, but people are still able to live independently. By stage 4, the symptoms are severe, and people begin to need assistance with things like dressing and walking and help with other activities of daily living. And by the end stage, the symptoms are severe. People have things like hallucinations and delusions, and a lot of people with Parkinson's who live long enough will go on to develop Parkinson's-related dementia. If you look at a graph of when some of the earliest signs that someone is headed toward Parkinson's disease show up, that graph goes out to 25 years before the diagnosis. And usually the first thing that shows up for people is chronic constipation. In fact, increasingly, researchers believe that Parkinson's probably starts in the gut, and one of the earliest symptoms is that the bowels don't move very well. And that is added to as time goes on. People start to get REM sleep behavior disorder, and they get excessive daytime sleepiness, where they're acting out their dreams at night and they're incredibly tired during the day. And then things start to get worse and they eventually get a diagnosis. And then you see that it kind of falls apart from there, with things like psychosis even being added toward the end. A lot of people with Parkinson's dementia and the related Lewy body dementia have vivid visual hallucinations, sometimes auditory hallucinations, sometimes even olfactory or sense or touch-based hallucinations. It's very devastating for people when they have those experiences, and it's hard to support someone in a situation like that. Now, some of you might be wondering, how is Parkinson's different from Alzheimer's disease? Well, Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disorder that affects dopamine-producing neurons, especially in the substantia nigra of the brain. So we're dealing with these neurons versus Alzheimer's disease that is dealing with cholinergic neurons. These are cells that are producing acetylcholine. We know that in Alzheimer's disease, acetylcholine gets really depleted, and that heavily affects a region of the brain called the hippocampus. That's like the memory center or the librarian of the brain. So there's brain deterioration in both, but they are very different diseases. Now, Braak, who was the researcher that first started to put together one of the prevailing theories about Parkinson's disease, hypothesized that the earliest symptoms of Parkinson's are in the autonomic nervous system, the enteric nervous system, and in the medulla and the olfactory bulb that controls the sense of smell. And loss of smell can occur years or even decades before Parkinson's symptoms show up. And increasingly, this theory seems to hold water because we see people with loss of smell very early on. They have sleep disorders. They have constipation. So the nervous system isn't functioning correctly to even cause the bowels to move the way that they should. And so researchers are increasingly looking upstream, saying, what are really the earliest symptoms? Let's not wait until someone has tremoring and their writing gets really small and they're rigid and they have slowed speech and they're not moving very well. Let's try to move upstream and figure out what's going on there. So if you look at a diagram of Braak's staging model, in stage 1 and 2, you get a few Lewy bodies. These are protein deposits that build up in the cells of Parkinson's patients. A few Lewy bodies show up in the brain stem and in the substantia nigra. And by stage 3 and 4, that spreads. And you can see in the green on the slides here that it spreads by late stages to much more of the brain. So what are the causes of Parkinson's disease? If we want to intervene early, we have to identify what's actually contributing to it. So the prevailing theories involve chemicals or other toxic substances, and there are also theories related to head trauma. If people have had trauma to the head, they're at greater risk of neurodegenerative diseases of all kinds, including both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. So those are some of the more common contributors. Now, to diagnose Parkinson's, there's a lot of work that could be done. It's one of those diseases where it really can be accurately diagnosed. But there are different symptoms and diagnostic tests that have to be used in combination. And it's important to remember that at least 2 of the 4 main symptoms have to be present over a long period of time for a neurologist to consider a Parkinson's diagnosis. So the main things you can see here on the slide. People have to have shaking or tremor, slowness of their movement, stiffness or rigidity in the arms, legs, or trunks, trouble with balance or falls. So their posture is just unstable. And then when people exhibit those kinds of symptoms, and they have at least two of those main symptoms for a long period of time, then it's appropriate to consider a Parkinson's diagnosis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, except to just say there's no standard treatment for Parkinson's disease. So neurologists and other providers have kind of an arsenal of tools that they might use. And many of them are medication related. Things like levodopa carbidopa, or otherwise known as Sinemet, or MAO-B inhibitors, or drugs that affect COMT. Amantadine, interestingly, was developed as an anti-influenza drug, but it was shown to benefit Parkinson's patients. And anticholinergics sometimes are helpful because they can slow down the cholinergic nervous system. And although that's detrimental to an Alzheimer's patient, sometimes it's helpful to a Parkinson's patient. The point is there's a lot of different options that a doctor might consider. But let's talk about a different doctor who's used a very different kind of approach. And I've learned a lot from her. She's a tremendous scientist and researcher. She's a naturopathic doctor. She also has a PhD and a Master of Public Health. Her name's Dr. Laurie Mischley. She runs a clinic called Seattle Integrative Medicine, and she has an online school called Parkinson School. She does a Parkinson Summers Camp. She trained dogs how to smell Parkinson's disease in very early stages so that people could be properly diagnosed early on. She's done a lot of research both through University of Washington and Bastyr University, and is funded both by private donations and by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Well, Dr. Mischley has noted that from a physician's perspective, doctors are usually looking for certain things in Parkinson's disease. They're paying attention to the motor disorder and the tremors and the stooped posture and the stiffness and rigidity and the masked face and the shuffling along and the limited arm swing. And those things tend to show up a little bit more close to the time of diagnosis. But from a patient's perspective, it's the non-motor changes that tend to irritate people and are most frustrating. It's the fatigue. It's the lack of motivation. It's the fact that they can't write very well anymore. It's that they have muscle pain and they're moving a lot slower and they can't sleep and they're constipated and they're lonely and they're depressed. Those things show up in a significant number of Parkinson's patients. They show up early on, and that's what really disrupts their life as much as anything. So you see here a list of how many patients experience these kinds of symptoms as a percentage. So for example, 80 to 85% of Parkinson's patients are fatigued, they have impaired handwriting, and they can't smell things very well. And you can look down the list and see how much people are affected by these symptoms. So those are the kinds of things people are really bothered with. Dr. Mischley, though, points out that subjective observations are actually better than objective observations in early Parkinson's disease because there are not really good objective measures for the kinds of very early things that happen for people. There aren't extremely good ways of measuring loss of smell, although here at A Mind for All Seasons, if you're involved in our protocol, you have access now to the Super Senses testing kit, where there is a way to quantify your ability to smell, and you're able to see over time whether that's improving or whether it's getting worse. But most doctors aren't using that yet. What about constipation? How do you quantify that? There's not a really good way to do it, but subjectively, people can say, yeah, I haven't gone to the bathroom in 3 days. It's been terrible. People may not have a good way of quantifying erectile dysfunction, but if you talk to any guy that's dealing with that, subjectively, he can tell you how much that disrupts his life and how much he hates that. Same thing with disrupted sleep or fatigue or anxiety or REM sleep disorder where you're acting out dreams. And so what Dr. Mischley argues is we actually need to teach people that these symptoms are very early symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and it's an opportunity to intervene and to do something so that the diagnosis doesn't come as late as it's coming. We can make a bigger difference the earlier we intervene. Now, I at first called this presentation a pragmatic approach to Parkinson's disease. What do we mean by pragmatic? Well, I'll define it and then I'll give you an example. When I got a degree in interpersonal and group communication, one of the things that we studied was a pragmatic approach toward communication. Pragmatism means it's practical. And whereas psychology tends to get inside the head and look at things like adverse childhood experiences and events and how they've affected a person's psychology, the communication field looks at observable patterns of behavior, and it just looks for patterns. And that has led to different kinds of therapeutic interventions that are highly effective. And we don't have to know all of the reasons why people are doing things or believing things or why they respond this way or that way. We just need to know what patterns tend to show up when there's a problem and what patterns tend to show up when things are going better. So that idea of pattern recognition becomes really important in a pragmatic or practical approach. That's what Jerry Sternin did when he was brought in by a group called Save the Children to work with malnourished children in rural Vietnam. There was a time where many children, most children in rural Vietnam were severely malnourished, and they were dying at much higher rates. And it seemed like an intractable problem because there was not good sanitation. Poverty was just insurmountable. And people didn't know what to do about it. The food supply there in those rural villages was not good. How do you solve a problem like that? Many people had tried. And when Jerry Sternin showed up in Vietnam, the foreign minister looked at him and said, "You have 6 months. I am so tired of you do-gooders coming in here, thinking that you're going to turn everything around, and nothing happens. So you have 6 months to make a difference." How do you deal with that? Well, Jerry Sternin used a technique called positive deviance. He was looking for any situation where things were actually better than the typical situation in those rural villages. So he went around and he interviewed mothers and villagers, asking if there are any children in the villages that were actually doing a lot better than their peers. And he found that indeed there were. And as the patterns emerged, he found that overall there were three things that made a big difference for the children in rural Vietnam. Children were healthier, they were bigger, and they were less likely to have severe problems related to malnourishment if their mothers fed them smaller portions multiple times a day. And the mothers who were making a difference for those children also added brine shrimp and sweet potato greens to the rice and broths that they were preparing for them. And they always ensured that they were scooping with the ladle from the bottom of the pot so that any of the food that had settled was scooped up. And that's what they were giving to their children. Well, the other villagers didn't want to use brine shrimp and sweet potato greens because that was considered low-class food. I guess even in third world countries, you can have a class structure, and that was a low-class kind of thing to do. So Jerry Sternin took the mothers that were using this technique, whose children were actually doing better, and they went around to the other mothers in Vietnam, and they taught them how to do exactly the same kinds of things. And within the 6 months, 65% of the children in the villages where Sternin was working were better nourished. It had an incredible impact on the health of those children. He was using something that was already working and just magnifying it. It's actually written about in a book by Chip and Dan Heath called The Power of Bright Spots. And it makes a big difference for people when an individual comes in and looks for what's working and just does more of that. So that's the idea of positive deviance. And we get a similar kind of lesson from scurvy. Scurvy was a sailor's disease, not exclusively, but it affected a lot of sailors in the 19th century. It killed as many as 2 million people. And it left people with awful sores and rashes and open wounds and brittle bones and dental decay and internal hemorrhaging. It was a horrible disease. 50% of sailors in the 19th century and earlier tended to die. Sailors accepted that fresh produce helped prevent scurvy, but nobody knew why. And as far back as 1535, a French sailor named Jacques Cartier had his crew that was faced with possible death because of a severe outbreak of scurvy. But the Iroquois natives in North America taught them how to make a special tea using the needles of spruce or cedar trees. Now, that tea worked because of the ingredients in it, especially the ascorbic acid, the vitamin C that was in it. But they didn't know that. They didn't know why it worked. They just knew that the Iroquois had a treatment for scurvy. And so when Cartier got back home, he started writing about it. So the lesson is that nobody knew what caused the disease, but there was a growing consensus about what helped the symptoms or what prevented the illness. So people didn't understand the disease of scurvy well. They just knew what helped. And so they started spreading the word. And for a few hundred years, people did a lot better and they weren't developing scurvy because they learned that one of the easiest ways to treat it is with limes. Limes cured scurvy. And they were using limes for 2, or some sources even say 300 or more years before anybody discovered ascorbic acid and understood how important it is to have some vitamin C in the body and what happens if we're completely depleted of it. Now, why do I share this in a presentation about Parkinson's disease? Because we can take a lesson from scurvy. We don't know everything that is contributing to Parkinson's disease, but the doctors are so busy looking for the ascorbic acid and that level of understanding that we might be missing the limes that are out there. So what you're looking at on this slide are some graphs that come from Dr. Mischley. And she has done the work to get thousands of people with Parkinson's disease to track their symptoms and to track their behaviors. And she has found that there are modifiable things that people can do to make a real difference in individuals who are living with Parkinson's. And as the disease progresses, people go from excellent health to good health, and then fair health, and then poor health. And you can see on the graph on the left that if you're on the upper line, if you start off with good health, but not excellent health, you might get 10 good years before your health becomes fair and then ultimately poor. If you start with excellent health, then you get 15 good years. But what if you deal with root causes and you actually modify the trajectory? It's possible to get 20 good years. And Dr. Mischley's goal is to collect enough data and to find enough examples of the limes that make a real difference in Parkinson's disease that people can live to 100 years of age without terrible symptoms that are wrecking their lives, even if we can't get rid of the disease, even if we don't know exactly how the disease starts. I think it's a very insightful way of approaching it. So, if you or someone that you love or serve is living with Parkinson's disease, please enroll in her study. There's a free app that goes with it that allows you to track things day to day, and you can become part of this growing large data set of people that for the last 10 years has been collecting information about what works and what doesn't. And when you look at things in large numbers of people, you're able to find trends. It's kind of like what happened with the limes and scurvy. If you're able to see that in large numbers of people, those who are eating limes don't get scurvy, then you don't even have to know why. You just know that it works. Just eat limes. So one of the things that Dr. Mischley has looked at heavily is diet. There's a lot of indicators and a lot of correlations about how different dietary approaches affect people with Parkinson's disease. One of the things that has been studied is a dietary intervention called the MIND diet, and it's been studied against the Mediterranean diet in Parkinson's disease. Now, most people would argue that both the MIND diet and the Mediterranean diet are generally very good for brain health. And I think that that's accurate. I think if people ate a Mediterranean diet or ate the mind diet as just sort of a foundational approach, they would do a lot better than the typical person eating the standard American diet. Dr. Mischley said that in the research looking at them head to head, the mind diet was twice as effective as the Mediterranean diet for being associated with slower rates of Parkinson's disease. That's a pretty substantial benefit. And that may lead to you asking, well, what symptoms actually improved on the mind diet? When people were applying it overall, they had less constipation, less apathy, less depression, less anxiety. They were able to sleep better. They didn't have as much muscle pain. Their brains were working better and they didn't have so many cognitive symptoms. They had decreased urinary and sexual dysfunction symptoms. Those are pretty substantial benefits from a dietary approach. Dr. Mischley put together a slide that you see here that compares aspects of the Mediterranean diet with aspects of the mind diet and looks for where there's an overlap. And overall, what she found is that if you're avoiding sweet or carbonated beverages, that's really good for anybody with Parkinson's disease. Things get a lot worse for Parkinson's patients when they're drinking fruit juices and sodas, especially diet sodas were one of the worst. It's not just about the sugar, but those sweet and carbonated beverages were a bad deal. People with Parkinson's do better when they're eating nuts. Now, not everybody can do that because sometimes they have swallowing issues. Maybe the nuts need to be ground up, but having nuts and seeds in the diet is a really good thing. And interestingly, people with Parkinson's disease in large data sets don't do well when they eat a lot of red meat. And we don't know all the reasons for that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But one of the reasons to look at large data sets is to see trends, and whether we understand them or not, we can at least recognize the data that's there, and we can choose to apply it or not. It was found that people that ate a lot of green leafy vegetables and other vegetables and berries did well when it came to Parkinson's outcomes. So when we talk about positive deviance, what we're talking about is what you see on this graph. Dr. Mischley has tracked thousands of people for years to see where the outliers are. And you'll notice that circled in red on this graph are some people who are outliers that are doing considerably worse than everyone else. And then circled in green are outliers who are doing considerably better. You'll see people in the excellent category of health who have been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease for 15 to 20 years. And what Dr. Mischley is looking at is what are they doing differently than the average person who's kind of following the general trend line? And what are people who are doing considerably worse than everybody else doing? That can tell us some things to start doing more of and some things that we can start doing less of. So what she found are things, dietarily at least, that are illustrated on this slide. If you're drinking diet soda, and if you're eating a lot of fried foods, and if you're eating fruit that's canned, if you're opening a metal can and taking fruit out of it, that is associated with much worse Parkinson's symptoms. Ice cream, as much as I love ice cream, and as much as most people love ice cream is terrible for a Parkinson's patient. It consistently makes things worse for them. What makes it better? Coconut oil and nuts and seeds and fresh vegetables and fresh fruit and fresh herbs and spices and fish and green tea and olive oil and beans and legumes in general. That's what shows up in the data. And sometimes people will see something like this and say, well, I don't like that. I want to have my ice cream, and can't I have any fun? This is not about forcing anybody to do anything. This is just looking at the data and saying, well, what does it tell us? And we individually get to make choices about what we will do and what we will not do. But if we can understand the consequences of our choices, or at least the potential consequences of what we do, then we're not just making a blind choice. We have to choose our pain in life. We can choose the pain of discipline. We can choose the pain of regret. We've all chosen one or the other at different times for different reasons, but what we need is information about what actually works for the largest number of people. So here's a list of things that Dr. Mischley talks about from her research. And you'll notice on the right, it has a score that's negative. The negative score means how much it reduces the severity of symptoms. So, right at the top of the list are fresh vegetables. If you eat a half cup of fresh vegetables, it's a 30-point reduction in the severity of Parkinson's symptoms. And you can see the point reductions for all of these other foods that are listed on this particular slide. That gives you an idea of the relative impact of some of these things. And what about dairy? I was talking about ice cream and how fun it is for people to hear that, oh, ice cream makes Parkinson's disease worse. But that might lead you to say, well, what about dairy in general? Dr. Mischley is unrepentant about saying that decades of data from multiple countries clearly demonstrates that if you are consuming dairy in midlife, it's associated with increased risk of Parkinson's later in life. We don't know all the reasons why that is. Is it because cows are eating grains that are sprayed with glyphosate and other chemicals, and that's getting into the milk supply? Maybe. Could it be that there are proteins in milk that are inflammatory and that the older we get, the harder it is to deal with that? And maybe the more chronic inflammation we develop with something like that? I suppose that's possible. Sometimes people will say, well, what if you can guarantee that the milk is made from cows that were only fed organic grass and they were really protected from exposure to herbicides and pesticides and other nasty chemicals? There is no study on that. There's no research to confirm something like that. So I can't answer that. I just know that in general, Dr. Mischley points out that after decades of research, we know that dairy and Parkinson's don't mix very well. So if you look at ice cream, for example, when people eat ice cream, and this is in a sample of 1,787 people, the baseline impact of having a half cup of ice cream is that it adds 31.2 points to the severity of Parkinson's disease symptoms. So you eat a half cup of fresh vegetables and it'll reduce it 30 points. You have the half cup of ice cream and you're going to increase it by a little bit more than the number of points that you would subtract for eating the fresh vegetables. And if you look at the p-value, which is a statistical value that tells us how likely it is that that occurs by chance, the p-value is less than 0.001. In other words, it's virtually impossible that this is just due to chance. There is a very strong, clear association between dairy and Parkinson's disease. Now, some of you in our AmFast community might be scratching your heads and saying, well, what about ketogenic diets for Alzheimer's patients and giving them full-fat dairy? You've talked about that before. Are you guys talking out of both sides of your mouth? I can see why that would be confusing. But as I said earlier, Alzheimer's disease is not Parkinson's disease. They are different disease states. And what works in an Alzheimer's patient might not work very well in a Parkinson's patient. And part of what we have to do as we evolve, as we learn, as the data comes out, is understand some of these nuances and some of these differences. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this. We have some clients with Parkinson's, and we have to do the best that we can for the individual situation. So as far as meat consumption, Dr. Mischley is very clear that the research overall shows that if you're consuming beef, chicken, and pork, that tends to make both Parkinson's disease risk go up and it makes Parkinson's symptoms worse. Now, am I saying that nobody should ever eat beef, chicken, and pork? No, I'm not. I've had some people say, well, what if it's truly organic, grass-fed beef, and the grasses aren't sprayed with terrible chemicals, and it's really good quality? That's got a lot of nutrition in it. I would agree that that's a far better thing to be eating. We just don't know if that affects people with Parkinson's disease differently than beef from a feedlot. There probably are some differences, but there are other theories about it. Some people say that animal protein has a significant amount of alpha-synuclein in it, and alpha-synuclein protein is what builds up in Parkinson's patients. So maybe someone has a leaky gut, and then if they're eating a lot of meat, they're leaking out alpha-synuclein protein, and that's getting to the brain. Maybe it's all theoretical at this point. We're just looking for the limes here. We're looking for what works and what doesn't work. Now, one thing Dr. Mischley says is that fish doesn't seem to be a problem, although I would say avoid fish that's higher up on the food chain because that more likely has heavy metals in it, like mercury. And mercury does relate to Parkinson's symptoms. Sometimes, in fact, we've seen people here at A Mind for All Seasons who had tremors and rigidity and other Parkinson's related symptoms, and they had heavy metal toxicity. And when they were detoxed of those metals, the tremoring and the rigidity went away. It doesn't always happen, but it's a possibility for some people. Dr. Mischley points out that turkey doesn't seem to be a problem for whatever reason, and fish seems to be okay. Frozen vegetables are a problem, and we don't know all the reasons why, but one theory is that frozen vegetables have to be blanched prior to freezing, and that might introduce or remove certain compounds that affect their health properties. So vegetables sometimes are sprayed with high levels of pesticides, and could it be that blanching them causes an issue? I don't know. It's theoretical at this point. But again, she's just looking at the data. Frozen fruit seems to be a lot better than frozen vegetables. Beliefs and behaviors also affect Parkinson's outcomes. And this is an area of the research that's kind of surprising. When people strongly believe that it's difficult to afford groceries and that they find it difficult to afford healthy food, they have a lot worse outcomes with Parkinson's disease. When people are stressed, when they're lonely, they do a lot worse with Parkinson's disease. That's interesting to me because being really social is a risk reducing factor for something like Alzheimer's disease. So we're learning more and more that some of these psychosocial factors, like having friends, having family members, spending time with people, communicating with others in meaningful and positive ways, that makes a real difference for people when it comes to neurodegenerative disease. What about supplements or nutraceuticals? It's really difficult to do studies on what people with Parkinson's are taking because they come from different manufacturers, and a lot of the supplements on the market do not have what is on the label. When they have third-party testing, many supplements are found to have between 0 and 500% of what's on the label. So even in Dr. Mischley's work, and she acknowledges this, you can be asking Parkinson's patients, what are you taking? And let's track your Parkinson's symptoms from day to day. And there's no guarantee that what they're taking is exactly what's listed on the label. But in general, she finds that there are a number of supplements that do tend to give better outcomes. And she points out, hey, this isn't a shopping list, but here are the things that tended to correlate with better outcomes in Parkinson's disease. Now, interestingly, most of the things on the list are things that clients here at A Mind for All Seasons that have had good outcomes in neurodegenerative diseases have used in one way or another. Sometimes they're in products that have some of these individual ingredients in combination with other things, so you might not recognize it. But other things like low-dose lithium, like lithium orotate, that's something that we talk to lots of people about. We measure DHEA for people. We talk a lot about high-dose thiamine because there's great research on high-dose thiamine in both Parkinson's patients and Alzheimer's patients. We talk a lot about glutathione as one of the most important antioxidants for the brain. Supplements like homocysteine factors are basically B vitamin supplements that are helping to control homocysteine levels. So I don't want to get too technical here, but this was the list. And again, that doesn't mean, oh, go out and buy all that stuff. There's a reason that we measure things here in our work. But it's interesting how much overlap there is in the list that Dr. Mischley identified. Now, there is especially strong evidence for using B12. Dr. Mischley found that 60% of people with a B12 higher than 600 were dementia-free 15 years after diagnosis. And actually, it's not directly from her work. She reported that, but there's research showing that. Well, 600 on your B12 that's in the normal range. There are a lot of people with a B12 level of 600 and their doctor says, oh, you're fine. Everything's great. They might have a level that's like 350 and their doctor would say, well, you're normal. But if the evidence shows that 60% of people, if they have a higher B12 than 600, will be dementia-free 15 years after getting a Parkinson's diagnosis, why are we not dosing people up with B12 appropriately? Interestingly, less than 20% of people with a B12 lower than 627 were dementia-free 15 years after diagnosis. In other words, when it comes to Parkinson's, B12 levels matter a lot. And there's other research that looks at neuropsychiatric symptoms and how they are affected by B12. This is a study from 2022 that showed that B12 deficiency can lead to very distressing neuropsychiatric symptoms, whether it's depression or anxiety or hallucinations. And speaking of hallucinations, this was research from 2024 showing that in 75% of patients, regardless of the condition that their hallucinations are associated with, 75% of the time, within 2 months of treating people with B12, the hallucinations stop. That is a lot of bang for very few bucks. But maybe that's why it's not talked about more. I don't want to be cynical or sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but vitamin B12 is a lot less expensive than psychotropic drugs. And nobody's going to get rich on the level of pharmaceutical company richness selling B12. But if 75% of the time the hallucinations are gone within 2 months of B12 treatment, why aren't we doing more of that? That's like finding limes and preventing scurvy. Dr. David Smith and his colleagues at the Oxford University Department of Pharmacology have been running one of the longest longitudinal clinical pathological trials in the world. They founded it in 1988. And this project, Project Optima, the Oxford project to investigate memory and aging, found that if people have a B12 level that's very optimal, like 1,000, if they have a folate level that's optimal, like higher than 15, if they have homocysteine that's less than 7, and if they have an omega-6 to 3 fatty acid ratio of 4 to 1 or lower, there's 73% less brain shrinkage over time. That's really impactful for just a few key nutrients. When it comes to B1, I mentioned earlier that Parkinson's disease responds really well to high-dose B1 therapy. There are books on that. Dr. Antonio Constantini did extensive work on that in Italy with over 2,500 patients. And they found that their patients who were using high-dose thiamine improved in terms of motor and non-motor symptoms. The disease didn't seem to progress. The carbidopa-levodopa medication seemed to work better. And they didn't have a lot of alterations of results on blood tests that were negative. So there's a lot of work that's been done to show something that has an impact. Now, what about antioxidants in support of the detox pathway? Here's a few supplements that we've used here at A Mind for All Seasons successfully to try to replace things like glutathione or to give people other antioxidants that make a difference in diseases like Parkinson's. This is a 66-year-old Vietnam veteran who has Parkinson's because of Agent Orange exposure. Let's see what happens after an IV of glutathione.
Go. Okay, say today is a sunny day.
Today is a sunny day.
Good, can we stop and turn around? Can we walk that way?
Sometimes I can, so we stop foot on it, go.
Turn around again? walk that way, okay? Okay. Now we have you stop and say to... Oh! You okay?
Yeah.
Today is a sunny day?
Today is a sunny day.
Good job. Okay. All right. All right. Good. Walk on down there. Go. Big steps. Go on. All right. Come on back. Turn around. Come on to me. Turn around. Let's go. Go for it. Big steps. Come on. Turn around. Come on back. Turn around.
I feel a lot better.
You look a lot better. That was about a half an hour ago we gave it to the time. Huh?
Yeah.
Back.
Boy, my legs are so much better.
There you go. All right. Let's get close to the camera.
Okay.
All right. Let me have you stop. Now I hear you say today is a sunny day.
Today is a sunny day.
It is, isn't it?
It is.
All right. Go ahead. Let's. You still recording? Let's see how he looks. Go for it. Come on back. What do you think?
I can't believe I'm walking. It's so hard to walk the other way, Doc.
I know.
This is wonderful.
All right. Okay, we good, Joe? Yes, sir. You look like a regular guy now.
I feel like a regular guy. I'm serious.
You look great.
So sometimes getting glutathione levels up can make a big difference. The effect that you saw in that particular patient who was working with Dr. David Perlmutter, a famous neurologist, wears off in about 24 hours. There's some residual effects for about 30 days, but it wears off. But there may be a reason for some people with Parkinson's to supplement with NAC and glutathione to try to get those levels up. And there's evidence that if you don't have enough of that antioxidant, that it's hard to clear exhaust out of the cellular engine. So reactive oxygen species builds up and it's harder to produce good energy. And so movement is impaired and it slows down. I'm not suggesting that everybody benefits from IV glutathione or glutathione supplementation, but it's one thing to consider that a lot of people are looking at. There's evidence that because toxins are often implicated in causing Alzheimer's disease, that removing toxins might be helpful. And using something like Ultrabinder from Quicksilver Scientific, which is considered a universal toxin binder, it has different ingredients that bind to different things. That might be helpful to some people. But it can also be difficult because binders tend to be constipating. And one of the earliest symptoms of Parkinson's is constipation. So before you could really use something like that, you got to have a strong foundation, make sure that the nutrient levels are really good and that the bowels are working well and that you're having consistent bowel movements. Otherwise, you could exacerbate things by using a binder. But we have seen people here at A Mind for All Seasons whose Parkinson's symptoms improved as they used kind of a chelation and binding process to remove things like heavy metals and herbicides and pesticides and other pollutants from the body. But again, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach here. Now, as we get ready to wrap up and go to some Q&A, I have to share as a public service announcement my frustration with the fact that Paraquat is still authorized for use in the United States. Paraquat has been banned in over 70 countries, and it's still legal in the US. You have to have special licensing to be able to spray Paraquat, which is an herbicide, but it's like having a license to kill, in my opinion. Just because you have a license doesn't mean that it's safe to be spraying it. Paraquat is used by researchers when they're trying to induce Parkinson's disease in mice. And it's also been shown to lead to Parkinson's disease in humans, not to mention other problems. And why this is still allowed in the US, probably only the money knows. It's deeply frustrating to me that we're still doing this to ourselves as a society, and it doesn't have to be that way. So be aware that A lot of the reason why we're seeing an increase in Parkinson's disease is because of increased use of chemicals in our environment. There are now over 85,000 chemicals that didn't exist 80 years ago. That is a lot for the body to deal with, and I think it's just Russian roulette that we're playing. It's devastating that the human body now is exposed to so much stuff that other humans were never exposed to. This is an abstract from this particular paper from the Journal of Neural Transmission that shows that pesticide exposure is associated with increased risk of Parkinson's, and that a large body of experimental research has examined the neurotoxicity of various pesticides on dopaminergic neurons using both in vitro and in vivo models of Parkinson's disease. In other words, in plain English, it's been shown that a lot of these pesticides that are used in our environment are associated with Parkinson's disease. So for over 200 years, limes were recognized as a treatment for scurvy before ascorbic acid was discovered, before anybody knew what vitamin C was. We're so busy trying to identify the equivalent of ascorbic acid for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's that we're not looking for the limes. And one of the reasons why I have such admiration for Dr. Mischley and her approach is she's just looking for what works in large numbers of Parkinson's patients, and what can that data tell us about how to both prevent and live better with the disease so that we can modify things. So let's stop there and let's go, for those of you who are here live, to some Q&A.